Well, welcome everyone to our final panel before our much-desired lunch break. I'm Daniel Bring. If you've seen me before, it was probably because I was running through the aisles quite a bit yesterday. But I've been very, very satisfied with how this conference is going, and I'm very glad that you're all here. I have an excellent group of panelists, and what we'd like to be talking about really are some of the material challenges that clean energy markets face, some of the challenges presented by climate, weather-related risks, and as well as America's strategic edge and how we can leverage that to sort of surpass our adversaries in the current state of strategic competition. So I would like to start off by talking about what we mean when we talk about energy markets. And how we structure those markets to ensure prompt delivery, effective market functioning, and of course, productive American clean energy sector. I'd like to start with you, Connor, as well as you, Chris. I know you guys are both oil and gas industry veterans, which of course comprises the world's largest and most liquid energy market. When we talk about structuring markets for clean energy, clean manufacturing, what do we really mean by that? What is the current state of the markets? What do we need to do to further create a functional market for these products?
Well, what a question to start off with, and I'm fully aware I'm standing between everyone in the audience and lunch, so I'll try to be brief, but it's interesting. I would just go back to what Secretary Wright said yesterday. It was fantastic remarks, not only because of his enthusiasm and his human-centric view of energy, but the way I interpreted it was a lot of talk about how you craft, shape, buttress markets. He talked about three particular examples. He talked about nuclear energy and how America had fallen behind and needed to utilize certain government programs. LPO was mentioned, and needed sort of a slingshot to catch up. So that was one example of how he was talking about policy to shape a market. He was talking about critical minerals, an area where it's really hard to compete with China without, to use his own words, occasionally a naughty word, industrial policy. And Mr. Westerman spoke about this. He spoke about Congressman Whitman's bill using critical mineral reserves and price controls. So critical minerals, another example of how we had to use policy to craft, to shape a market. And then thirdly, Secretary Wright mentioned geothermal, a more fledgling technology where the United States, due to its innovation and due to its geography, topography, stands to be very successful and potentially very dominant, but needs investment early on to get it to grow. He gave the example of while he did not support many IRA tax credits, he supports those for geothermal. So I think it's very interesting, having been in this town a little while, to see how this conversation has changed. There's a concession, or not a concession, an acknowledgement that markets, in order to be competitive and fair and strong, need some crafting, some shaping from the government.
That's exactly right, and that's why if you're wondering, what's the American Energy Leadership Institute, that's fine. We started literally basically today. So it's a brand new enterprise, and the reason why we wanted to get this going was because of exactly what Connor's talking about. We have to really reorient the way folks, I'm on the right, I know there's a mixed political lean here, but it's a lot of folks broadly on the right. We have a tendency to just be, market truthers and believe that as long as we just let the free market rip, we can solve all these problems. And trust me, I get that tendency. Like you said, I have an oil and gas background that's worked very, very well for incumbent industries. But if we're thinking strategically about the risks of a Chinese hegemonic world, if we're thinking about the risks of I'm not a climate doomer or whatever, but there are real risks to climate change. If we are thinking about those things strategically, it's going to require us to kind of break from that tendency to just go back to markets and hope that everything's going to get solved. We need to think bigger. We need to think strategically. And one of the biggest reasons, I think politically about this, the left is already doing that. And so for their preferred ways of doing things, their preferred industries, their preferred technologies, they're already thinking about the kinds of industrial policies, incentives, tax credits that they want. And we've seen it in the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've seen it in how they operate that way. And so there needs to be an entrance from the right into that debate, into that fight, so that we're not just ceding it entirely to the political left, and also not doing it in a way where we just, as folks on the right, go in and do a watered down version of what they're doing. We need a decidedly different approach if we're going to actually do this in the kind of like America First way that is so politically popular right now on the right.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And of course, fracking, which was one of the largest, most important events in the oil and gas.
It's downstream from government policy.
Absolutely. And of course, it was, very geostrategically important in the last decade. To talk about that further and to sort of begin our conversation about risk, which I think is the real crux of this issue, how should we think about the intersection of geopolitical risk, which, of course, like you, Chris, I'm a conservative, and I'm very concerned about the risks of ceding our energy markets to China, basically. But how do we view that, the intersection of that with climate risk, which I think to a lot of conservatives might seem a bit more illusory or just less material?
Right, and this is where our strategic advantage comes in as well, is the fact that we haven't been comfortable with having the conversations around climate for a long time because we are worried that all these left-leaning policies and regulations and taxes are going to come in as a result has left us largely unfamiliar with the reality as it exists. And the reality as it exists is that we are 4 times cleaner than the Chinese economy. For making the exact same widgets or whatever, we are 4 times cleaner. And so if we want to really take that Chinese risk seriously, we can lean in on this about how much cleaner and better we do on emissions. And so that involves potentially trade policy, so accounting for environmental standards in imports into the United States so that they have to play on the same level playing field that we do. That's a very Trumpian kind of America First policy. Folks usually call it a pollution tariff. Trump always talks about how we export or we offshore to what he calls filthy pollution havens. So that's already salient on the right. And then on top of that, we just have to get better talking about it. And a policy like that makes it a little bit easier. So if we're comfortable saying we're cleaner and being proud of that and being patriotic and nationalistic about the way that we take care of the environment, that's an awesome way to bring in the right and start having these harder conversations, not just about the risk of, like I said, a Chinese-run world order, but also the potential risks of not taking the environmental side of it seriously as well.
So could I piggyback on that possibly, Daniel?
Sure.
Yeah, and my friend Osho might be able to better speak at some juncture to climate risk from a financial perspective and investor perspective, but I fully agree with Chris on how we talk about it. One of the common threads in this room that's so great is if you're here, you want to build stuff. That's great. That's wonderful. And when we build that stuff, we want to sell that stuff. And there are, so Chris spoke about sort of, the pollution tariff concept and things like that, but there are folks that do take into account, even if you don't care at all about being cleaner here, and I would suggest there are benefits to our energy being affordable, reliable, and clean, probably in that order. But there are foreign markets who want to buy the stuff that we all want to make and do care about whether that stuff is cleaner. So whether it's, you hear about the European Union with their CBAM, their carbon border adjustment mechanism, they will impose a fee on goods exported to their borders based on the carbon intensity of those products, whether we like it or not. Now, there's certain covered products like steel and aluminum that we don't export a lot of, but what about hydrogen producers who want to export methanol and ammonia? We had a French utility cancel importing LNG because it wasn't clean enough, and then proceeded to go buy it from Russia. But And there's only so much diplomacy we can do to convince folks that they should buy our stuff and not take so much of this clean thing into account. But I want us to be cognizant, hopefully at a future abundance energy imperative summit, that yes, we want to make a lot of stuff, but we need to be cognizant of where we're going to sell the stuff and the factors that they take into account.
So, Osho, I'd really love for you to jump in here and provide, a material perspective on what the risks that American producers are facing from the current kind of inequalities in clean energy markets, and sort of what are the risks more broadly posed by some of the trends we're seeing.
Yeah, so thank you for having me here, and it's a great question. I think climate risk often gets left out of the energy conversation, and it becomes more of like an existential threat around the use of fossil fuels and pollution and things like that. But really, when you think about what energy is, regardless of if it's renewables or fossil fuels or hydrogen or nuclear, it is a byproduct of the physical systems that happen within the Earth. And so a lot of the work that we do at Arbol is packaging climate risk into financial products to essentially offset the risks that come up. So best way to describe it is, let's take an example. You may have like a wind producer, and their whole business is dependent on wind generation, and their downstream customers are dependent on how much they can generate. However, if wind speed slows down in their particular area, their generation is going to be reduced. The same kind of argument can be made around a solar plant. Temperatures start becoming important for fossil fuels, whether or not you can drill. So what we do at Arbol is we get hyperlocal data for these specific wind farms, solar farms, these drill areas, and we create a financial product where you can strip out that weather component and you can hedge that. So the producer is able to buy essentially insurance or some sort of parametric solution to get coverage anytime wind speed falls below a predetermined amount. And so this has vast implications when it comes to project financing, because you can even out a lot of the volatility that occurs between generation and demand, and you can really take that climate risk and offload it to capital markets that actually want exposure to climate risk, because it's an uncorrelated asset class compared to things like stocks and bonds. They're looking for yield, and they're looking for creative ways to get it.
That's very fascinating. We heard yesterday Secretary Wright talk about line sag and basic instrumentation, and how that level of data can really help us understand, help producers and grids transmit more electricity. To dive into this question of how we frame these risks and how we make them part of the policy conversation. What would all of you think are sort of the most important things to highlight, not only to policymakers, but also to industry folks and people who are and energy innovators, which we certainly have represented in this room?
Well, I think we've got to connect all those folks. I think when you talk to the energy innovators, the folks in the industry...
We're trying.
I know. Great job, guys. This is a great conference. We've got to have more of these. We've got to have more conversations like this, because the folks that are in the industry know what Osho's talking about, know how these markets work, know what's needed. But it's so disconnected often from the communicators and the policymakers who have no idea. And when you talk to them about it, and trust me, with AELI, we're trying to bring that to the Hill and advocate accordingly for policy stuff. But it's often the job of, our greatest foot soldiers and lobbyists to explain how these things work. And there's just a level of technical expertise that comes from the industry that is not getting communicated to policymakers, because there's not enough spaces like this to explain, A, that these problems exist in the first place, B, the problems are basically constantly changing, and C, there are solutions that people have already come up with that we can implement into policy as legislation or executive orders or whatever. And so that's what I keep running into when I'm talking to members of Congress, when I'm talking to their staff, is their lack of understanding on this stuff is the main problem to getting policy changed. The politics are already there for a lot of this stuff. I mean, I'll be on Mornings with Maria for 3 hours tomorrow morning. So if you want to watch me talk about this stuff for 3 hours, you can do that. And when I'm on Fox and I'm talking about these policies, the audience loves it. There's no hesitancy. That the environment stuff is not worrisome to them. They're just excited to see somebody who wants to build, baby, build, and do energy dominance. But the technical expertise has to be connected to the policymakers to get that done. And luckily, we're starting with the Energy Imperative Summit. Hopefully, we do a lot of these many times, and people can continue to connect folks, because Congressman Westerman is a unicorn as a member of Congress who is so policy focused. Not to say that members of Congress aren't, but he is so unique in that regard of how seriously he takes this. And we shouldn't take that for granted, and we should create a dozen Bruce Westermans by having conferences like this.
And I just add a little bit in, echoing the sentiment that, there have not been too many instances where we've had philanthropy, venture capital, journalists, think tanks, Hill staff. This is a terrific audience and a great forum in which to have these dialogues. And we're doing well as sort of a team with aligned goals of all sort of using the same terminology. We're talking about, abundance, dominance, market crafting, energy imperatives, but I don't want us to get too comfy with, code words and shibboleths, because what comes next is having harder conversations, like Chris said, where we know that there's this 80% between the left and the right that's really comfortable talking about abundance and building stuff. But talking about climate and just talking about the ways in which it might penetrate markets and affect markets has people a little squeamish. And that's understandable, because we just came from 4 years where it was not talked about in a helpful or often even in a really rational way. So folks in these sorts of audiences, and we have some conservatives on this panel, need to not be afraid to grapple with what climate means, where it's important, where it's less important, because I read something on maybe a fortune cookie about what good markets are. I think it's good markets are shaped by information and strengthened by competition. So the former is very important, because if we put our heads in the sands when it comes to climate matters, if we don't even acknowledge that China is polluting unfettered and how that distorts our markets, if we don't even acknowledge, as Senator Bill Cassidy likes to say, that apparently you can trace emissions from China all the way to our own borders in California and in the West, we're just ignoring certain climate inputs to what we want to be strong, free, and fair markets.
Yeah, and I think this hits on a very important point, right? Earlier, I alluded to this idea that climate risk starts becoming an existential threat, and that's what a lot of the discussions have been around. But in reality, the impact from climate events are becoming more and more economically damaging, and so we don't have to necessarily think about it as, how do we keep Miami from being underwater in 50 years, and why, we have the AC on in here, why we're all bad people for doing that. Really, it's a matter of looking at how demographics have changed, where they now live, and how those environments are increasingly impacted by climate events. And it's a lot of costs for the public infrastructure, it's a lot of monetary costs, and it's a lot of time costs as well. And partially this also goes into the demand side of the energy question as well, right? You have more and more kind of smart devices, EVs were popular for a little while, and maybe they'll be popular again. We need better production, higher quality production to be able to satisfy all of this demand. And that gets left out when we start talking about climate risk as a 50-year thing.
Absolutely. So, I'd like to turn now also to kind of a more proximate threat that was identified both by Secretary Wright yesterday, was underscored by our opening panel on AI demand, is strategic competition. We haven't talked about it very much so far, but I think that it is obviously kind of undergirding a lot of the practical reality behind this conference. When we think of strategic competition, and when we discuss strategic competition, we tend not to really focus in on, I think, individual policies or individual risks that emerge from that. And we can talk about, there are many conversations we had on cybersecurity or on various national security risks. But let's talk sort of economic risks. Let's talk about the damage to American producers. Let's talk, which of course has been witnessed in terrible detail over the last 25 years. How do we frame this conversation around that?
It's one of those things that we've been having this conversation. We've mostly been talking around each other. The solutions are either we, to the earlier thing, we become totally focused on just freeing up the market as much as possible because that's what we do well, and that makes sense. If we have a competitive edge with China, it's our capitalist free market system, right? Or we freak out and we say we got to completely retool it and do the Chinese model, which we have no experience doing, and we really probably would do very poorly. And I think a lot of the tendency to subsidize and send money to various technologies, we are not going to do that well. What we need to do is craft markets, and we need to find ways to, where there are geopolitical risks, where there are market risks, craft policy around that to move the market in certain ways. The market is not going to solve the great power conflict with China. I know that may upset some of our libertarian friends, and I love you all, and you're great people, I'm sure. But that's the reality. We are going to need to shape markets in a way that moves towards our geopolitical and national goals. And that doesn't mean jettisoning the free market. That means recognizing how awesome markets are and how powerful they are and how uniquely powerful the American markets are. But make sure that that's moving in a direction and not just arbitrarily trying to grow for growth's sake. And I think we've seen a shift in how we talk about it, especially on the right. And I think that's really, really positive. So all of these conversations about economic growth, jobs creation, it's not just, tax cuts and hoping for the best, right? There are real serious conversations happening at conferences like this about how we craft markets, how we shape markets, how we create incentives in the right places, rather than the left's alternative, which would be just to throw a bunch of money at the problem, which we cannot do because we don't have state-owned enterprises the way that China does, and we don't want it, right? This is our advantage over China.
Osho, I would love to get you to sort of jump in and talk about the financial risk management perspective. How does this materialize?
Yeah, everything that was just said was like music to my ears because I do think this is, it's a bit hammer and nail of me, but I do think this is a problem that can be solved or mitigated using kind of innovative financial products, particularly in the insurance world, and a lot of regulatory clarity that could help encourage more of this innovation would be helpful. So to kind of dive into it a little bit more, when you have one of the great things that we have here is a very efficient and highly functional capital markets, and so you have all these investors that have money to deploy and they want to find new and creative ways of getting uncorrelated yield. We've seen the boom in private equity. We saw the boom in venture capital. I would love to see that boom in infrastructure project investment. And part of that will happen when you allow for project financing that evens out the cash flow generation from energy products by stripping climate risk, by stripping other risks out of that equation. Investors will be more open to putting up the money for renewable development, for nuclear development, that sort of infrastructure project. And there's a lot of money to be made, and they recognize that, but in its current state, it's very hard. Not all of us here have worked on trying to build a wind farm or things like that. So a very simple example I can tie it back to is anyone who's purchased a home with a mortgage, it's instituted that you get home insurance wrapped into that mortgage. We should have a similar idea around insurance for different risks wrapped into project development. And that's basically the high-level idea that I would love to see kind of be pushed forth on the regulatory side.
Connor?
And except for, a few nerdier folks, before January or whenever COVID was, 2020, we didn't really think about supply chains. And realizing how brittle our supply chains were during COVID was really an example of economic security becoming national security. And we've been talking about it ever since, and that's good. And we've really, in my view, only begun to scratch the surface of which supply chains are brittle and why. We talk about critical materials, we talk about semiconductors, we do things like the CHIPS Act, and that's great, and that's a step in the right direction. But Daniel, you mentioned AI. I think we're so fixated on AI, the technology, that we forget that there are supply chains necessary for AI. How many people in here have heard of high temperature superconducting wire? Okay, many, because this is a particularly long,
yes,
really
yes,
unique
it's a
audience.
great
yes, that made my day. But I wasn't expecting. But many of you did not. And for example, that's a type of, and Secretary Wright alluded to this yesterday, transmission. We're going to need the transmission necessary to get the electrons from point A to point B. And it isn't always the sort of future stuff. I mean, if we talk about something like cement, the second most used and consumed thing on Earth after water, most of us think it's just crushed up rocks and don't realize that we haven't built a new cement plant in this country in 20 years. We import it still from Turkey, Vietnam, Russia, China, Mexico, and there are parts of this country where you have to pay 2 to 4 times as much to get access to it. Tell me anything that you can build in this country without cement. So I think we're just scratching the surface. I think this time next year when we're having this summit again, we're going to be talking about new supply chain risks and exposures.
Yeah, just to add one small point there, you're completely right about the inputs that go into AI. One of the pieces that's often left out of that conversation, because the focus is on the hardware and the material side, is also the data side. Our scientific agencies, NOAA in particular, have done a tremendous job of collecting hundreds of years of highly granular data. So if you imagine this, these AI systems or this super AI system that can, perfectly model power grids and things like that, it's going to need that data. And that is an advantage that America has over other countries, this vast history of highly granular, highly accurate data collection.
Absolutely. And noting that we're running up on time, and I don't want to keep people from lunch longer, I'd love to just go around and touch on policy recommendations. I know, Connor, you have some ideas, but what are the policy tools that that lawmakers, that the administration, that regulatory officials can use to make sure that keep markets safe for American producers and increase access to energy?
Unfair to ask me this with mere moments left. There are so many I want to dig into, and Chris mentioned pollution tariffs. I think depending on the product or the country with which that's deployed, that makes a lot of sense. Certainly, all the permitting reform that Thomas and Congressman Westerman were talking about. I think even not throwing the baby out with the bathwater on certain IRA tax credits. A sensible 45X to help with critical minerals manufacturing seems sensible. Beyond that, still having tools like the Loan Programs Office, the Office of Strategic Capital that can help with financing projects that the private sector may not dig into. So was that too many, Daniel?
No,
okay.
That's quite all right. Chris?
Broadly, everything that Connor said on the specific policies, absolutely. But we need to think about it concretely as America is not an economic zone. It's not just a market for others to exploit. It's a nation. And so we need to be putting those policies in place, acting as if that's the case. And so doing all the stuff that Connor is talking about and then building on it. Continuing to build on that strategy is exactly what we need for the great power competition with China.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here for this broad-ranging panel.